How's it going? I'm Sam, and today I'm going to talk to you about miracles. In the next few videos, I'm going to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And so I thought before I get started on that, I should do one video that talks about miracles in general, and another video that talks about, kind of the background of resurrection. What Jewish people meant when they said people were going to rise from the dead. So I think I'll talk about miracles today. The reason I'm talking about this should be obvious. If Jesus rose from the dead, then obviously that's a miracle, because we know enough about the way the world works to know that people don't ordinarily rise from the dead. Unless you're talking about somebody dying on an operating table or something and being revived. We're talking about somebody being dead, in their grave for 2 or 3 days, and then coming back to life. That's if something like that happened, then that's a miracle. So I want to just respond to a few objections that people might have to miracles. The first objection is that the natural world is all that exists, and it behaves according to certain laws, and we know, we have a pretty good grasp on the way the world works, and we know that dead people don't come back to life. So that's one argument. Well, the response to that argument, I've already given a response to that argument. If you go look at my whole series on idealism, naturalism, and dualism, I already argued that it's not true that the physical world is all that exists. That minds, at the very least, are immaterial things. And then I did a section on the existence of God, and I showed not only that there is some sort of God, but that this God looks a lot like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. That sort of God. And so we have good reason to think that Judaism, Christianity, Islam are true. So a God like that exists. Well, if a God like that exists, then it would be perfectly capable of having causal interaction in the physical world and bringing about miracles. And so the objection from naturalism, I guess you could call it, doesn't work. There's another argument by David Hume. This one's probably the most famous argument. And most arguments against miracles kind of bounce off of David Hume. They're similar to David Hume in some way. I wrote a paper about David Hume's argument against miracles when I was in college, so I used to know a whole lot about it, and I could probably make an hour-long video on it. But I'm going to try to be brief now, partly because I don't want this to be a long video, and partly because I don't remember everything. So, but let me try to give you the skinny on it. There were two parts to David Hume's argument. The first part was, you can think of it as an in-principle argument, that there could never be evidence sufficient to warrant belief in a miracle. And the second part is an in-fact argument, where he argues that, in fact, there never has been a miracle that had good evidence going for it. So, I'm going to mainly talk about the in-principle argument. So here Hume says that he has this particular view of probability, and the way it works is like, the more you witness something happening in the past, the more likely it is to continue being true in the future. So every crow you've ever witnessed in the past has been black. Probably all crows are black. They're going to be black in the future. Or, say 25% of the crows that you've observed in the past have been white, and 75% have been black. Well, what's the probability that the next crow you meet is going to be white or black? Well, there's probably a 75% chance it's going to be black, 25% is going to be white. So Hume argues that the laws of nature are arrived at through uniform past experience. That means that we've arrived at these laws because there's never been any exception to them in the past. And so some of these laws pertain to miracles, because miracles, according to Hume, are violations of the laws of nature. When a miracle happens, that means nature is behaving in a way that's different than the law describes. Well, if these laws are described by uniform past experience, then that's as much as a whole proof that the law is true and that the miracle is not. So in Hume's argument, he's pitting miracles against the laws of nature as if they can't both be true. If there's a miracle that happens, that shows that the law is not true. And if the law is true, that shows that the miracle is not true. So this to me seems to be a mistake because if a miracle happened, that's not the claim that nature just spontaneously deviated from its usual course. All the laws of nature can stay perfectly intact when a miracle happens. All a miracle is, it's an event in the natural world whose cause is not part of the natural world. So if the cause is not part of the natural world, then the way nature usually behaves doesn't tell us anything about whether these kinds of events can happen or how they happen or whatever. So for example, say Jesus walking on water. Well, we know that, ordinarily a human would sink in the water. But Jesus walking on water doesn't violate that. Gravity was still acting on him. All that's happening now is like God is exerting a force up, or Jesus maybe has the power to exert a force up to resist the force of gravity to allow him to walk on water. So the laws of nature stay perfectly intact. So that's one thing. It's a mistake to pit these things against each other. But there's an even worse thing. When Hume says that the laws of nature are arrived at by uniform past experience, what he's saying there is that there has never been a deviation from these natural ways that things happen. In other words, miracles have never happened. And so if he's saying that miracles have never happened and therefore we have these laws and therefore miracles never happen, that's circular reasoning. And so that's the major flaw in David Hume's in principle argument. And there's a bunch of other flaws in it. The way he comes up with, the way he thinks probability works is a big mistake. And there was a guy who wrote a book called Hume's Abject Failure. And it looks at how Hume looked at probability. But that goes into Bayes' theorem and stuff, which I'm not gonna go into right now. Because Bayes' theorems is difficult. I don't understand it that well. So anywho, so another one that you hear a lot these days is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I think that's kind of a sloppy way of putting it because you can poke all kinds of holes in there. There's all kinds of ambiguities about what sorry, somebody's texting me and it's distracting me. What was I saying? Yeah, there's ambiguities about what it means for an event to be extraordinary or what it means for evidence to be extraordinary. But I do agree with the general gist of it. The more prima facie unlikely an event seems to be, the more skeptical you're going to be of it. And the more skeptical you're going to be, the stronger evidence it's going to take to get you to concede or change your mind or something like that. Now, this goes all back to everything that I said about noetic structures early on in my series on epistemology. The way the noetic structures work is you've got all these beliefs in your head about how the world works and everything. And whenever you're faced with new information, if that information coheres with what you already believe, then it's easy for you to accept that new information as being true. But if some new information comes at you and it completely contradicts everything that you understand the world to work like, then you're going to be skeptical of that. And it's going to take a lot because the only way you can accommodate that new information is if you make a bunch of adjustments to your noetic structure. In other words, you have to change a whole bunch of beliefs in order to accept this new thing. So whether an event is extraordinary or not is really relative to each individual. It depends on your noetic structure. If you're a person who believes that only the physical world exists, and somebody tells you that a miracle happened, well, that's just going to be impossible. You're not going to be able to accept that. But if you're the kind of person who maybe has seen miracles himself, and somebody tells you that, like say you had an experience of some extraordinary event, and somebody else claims that they had this similar experience, it would be a whole lot easier for you to believe that if you had had that experience yourself. Because it doesn't clash with your noetic structure now. You know that things like that can happen. So whether an event is extraordinary or not depends on what you already believe. And this is the way Bayes' theorem works. You have this prior probability that's based on everything you know up to now. And then you evaluate evidence in light of that prior probability. So the evidence allows you to update your probability that something happens or something. And so all your prior information counts. Well, I have already argued that there's gods, that there's minds and stuff like that. So we have all that. If you've watched the whole series, you have all that should inform your prior probability about whether miracles can happen. Now, even if you accept that miracles do in fact happen, there's still reason to be skeptical when they do happen, because even if miracles are possible and even if they happen, they're nevertheless rare things. And so there's still something extraordinary about them, however hard it may be to put our finger on what that is. And so we should still, I at least am skeptical whenever I hear stories, that contain miracles or things like that. And that's consistent with my noetic structure about how the way the world usually works. I believe that miracles can and do happen, but I believe that they're so rare and unusual that when somebody claims it did happen, I'm naturally skeptical about it. So it's even more ambiguous to talk about what extraordinary evidence entails. Because let's say, compare two scenarios. Let's say I'm on my way, let's say you and I meet at work, and I tell you that on my way to work today, I ran into my girlfriend at the grocery store, and we kissed. Well, you wouldn't consider that an extraordinary claim. But let's suppose that I said that I ran into Kate Beckinsale at the grocery store, and we kissed. Even though the same event, two flesh and blood human beings met at the grocery store and kissed, they're basically the same kind of claim. Nevertheless, you would consider one to be extraordinary and the other to be not extraordinary. So in the case of my girlfriend, the only evidence you would require is probably just my word. You'd take my word on it. But if I said it was Kate Beckinsale, it might require a little bit more. Like maybe, what if I showed you a selfie that I took with Kate Beckinsale, and in the selfie she's kissing me on the cheek or something like that. This has never happened, by the way. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. And Kate, if you're watching this out there, I apologize if this is embarrassing to you. But anyway, I'm just being silly. So anyway, a selfie is obviously not extraordinary, because if I showed you a selfie of my girlfriend and I, you wouldn't consider that extraordinary. But if I showed you a selfie of my of Kate Beckinsale and me, well, maybe you would consider that extraordinary. I don't know, but I mean, they're the same. It's the same equipment, the same iPhone, same flesh and blood people, same light waves. So this whole concept of extraordinary evidence is ambiguous. I think kind of what we mean is just the evidence has to be stronger. So I think a better maxim to go by besides the phrase extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is pithy, and that's why people adopt it. But it's kind of sloppy when you really try to pick it apart, and so I don't like it. I would prefer to say that any claim you make requires adequate evidence, and whatever is adequate depends on the claim and what the prior probabilities are and things like that. And so you may require more evidence to convince you that Kate Beckinsale kissed me than you would that my girlfriend kissed me. And by the way, it's a whole lot more likely, this is just for your information, it's actually a whole lot more likely that Kate Beckinsale will kiss me than it is that my girlfriend will kiss me. And the reason for that is because Kate Beckinsale at least exists. My girlfriend doesn't exist. So if I got kissed by a non-existent person, that would be pretty extraordinary. Just being silly again. So, but anyway, let's say that it is highly unlikely that Kate Beckinsale kisses me, or that any kind of somebody lands on the moon, or any kind of crazy thing happened. Let's say that is really unlikely. Well, the evidence doesn't have to be extraordinary to overcome that. You can just use mundane evidence, but have more of it. The more mundane evidence you have, like for example, if somebody witnessed an event that we would ordinarily think is unlikely, that could be strengthened if a second person said they witnessed the same thing, and a third person, a fourth person. The more people that says they saw the same thing, even though each of those instances of saying they saw something is pretty mundane, the cumulative effect can overcome almost any prior improbability or something. So no matter how unlikely an event is, unless it's impossible, if it has some positive probability to it, be it ever so small, it can be overcome by enough mundane evidence. Now, as far as my case for the resurrection, I have tried to raise the prior probability as much as I can in my arguments for the existence of the soul and the existence of a God that's very much like the Christian God. So I'm going to try to carry the rest of it with evidence for the resurrection. But whether I do the job or not is really going to depend on your noetic structure. For me, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is adequate, given everything, all my background beliefs, everything that I know and believe up till now. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is adequate to persuade me that Jesus was raised from the dead. Whether it is for you or not, I can't say. I've done the best I can in this thing. So I've met some people who, will not believe in a miracle no matter what, because it's so far-fetched, so crazy that there's just no conceivable evidence. I think I saw this debate with, I don't remember who it was, but Matt Dillahunty was the atheist in the debate. Oh yeah, I think it was Mike Licona, and Mike Licona came up with this scenario where, like, what if you saw me get my head cut off, you saw my head roll on the floor, and my body drop, and then you walked out of the room, and then 5 minutes later, I walked out and I had stitches on my neck or whatever. You could see the scars and my head was attached and I was walking and talking again. What would you think about that? Would you think that a miracle had happened? And Matt Dillahunty said, no, he would sooner believe that he had gone crazy than to believe that a miracle like that had happened. And so I acknowledge there are some people out there that there is just no conceivable evidence that will ever move them to the resurrection. But I acknowledge I'm not going to be able to convince everybody with this evidence. Because, it's always possible. You can always retreat into a brain in a vat or something. If you really bent on being skeptical about anything, there's always an out. You can always claim at the very least that solipsism is true. You can claim to be a Boltzmann brain or something and nothing is real other than your mind or something like that. So you can deny anything. This is the pattern I've seen a lot too in a lot of debates between Christians and atheists, where no matter what the Christian says, the answer that the atheist gives essentially boils down to nuh-uh. And that's kind of the impression I get from Matt Dillahunty. That's his modus operandi, and pretty much all his debates is to say, nuh-uh. But he does it in more words than that, but that's essentially what it boils down to. And you can do that, I guess. And I'm not trying to belittle people that do that either, because like I said when I was talking in my series on noetic structures, your noetic structure kind of determines what is going to be believable to you or not. And so if two people look at the same evidence and one is persuaded and the other is not persuaded, it's not necessarily because one is being reasonable and the other is being unreasonable. It's because they have different noetic structures, and those noetic structures are going to determine what's reasonable for them to believe and what's unreasonable for them to believe. And so, unless I could just perform an operation on your brain and completely change your noetic structure to make it more like mine, there's just some people I'm never going to be able to reach, no matter how good the evidence for the resurrection is. But anywho, I guess that's all I wanted to say. It seems like there is one other argument against miracles that I want to, or against affirming a miracle that I want to say. And this is the argument that some New Testament scholars say, which is that as professional historians, we cannot we cannot say whether a miracle happened or not. We can make all kinds of, because they have this kind of thumb rule that they use that any historical claim you make has to be analogous to our everyday experience. So when it comes to miracles, or when it comes to normal events like somebody being killed in battle or something, we know that happens all the time. It happens in our experience. Maybe you weren't on the battlefield, but maybe you had a relative that was, or whatever. But we have plenty of evidence that people did die in battle. So if you're reading about history a long time ago and you hear about how this battle happened and people get killed, well, as a historian, you can adjudicate on that. But when it comes to a claim that a miracle happened, the reason a historian can't make a judgment about that is because that requires making worldview claims. You have to claim that the world is very different than our everyday experience, and historians just aren't equipped to do that. Well, it seems to me that basically what they're saying, and Bart Ehrman makes an argument like this. Basically what they're saying is that as historians, as professional historians, they simply can't do that. It's against the rules of historical methodology to claim that miracles happened. Even if that's true, that's irrelevant to the question of whether we, as just not as historians, but just as thinking human beings, can ever be warranted in affirming that a miracle happens. And it seems to me that if you have historical evidence that somebody was alive, historical evidence that they were killed, and historical evidence that sometime later they were alive again, then maybe as a historian, you're not allowed to say, well, they rose from the dead. But it seems like just as a thinking human being, you can put those pieces together and conclude that he rose from the dead. And if he rose from the dead, then given the way nature usually operates, or the way it usually doesn't operate, you can affirm that that's a miracle. A miracle happened. So that's my first point, is I don't care whether it's a historical claim or not. It can be a philosophical claim or whatever. What matters to me is whether it's a true claim and whether the claim is warranted by the evidence. As human beings who can think, do philosophy, do history, do science, do math, do literature, whatever, you don't have to be a professional, but just as a human being, you can think about all these different things. You can learn about all these different things, and you can apply all your epistemological tools to the question of the resurrection of Jesus. And it doesn't matter whether it's historical, philosophical, or whatever, but you can use all the tools at your disposal to come to this conclusion. There are no rules limiting the tools that you can use. So even if historians do have certain methodological inhibitions, I guess you say, or rules that they can't violate in order to practice history and to publish in journals, we as just normal human beings are not restricted in that way. Historians are not restricted in their day-to-day lives. I mean, sure, maybe a historian is forbidden from claiming in a paper that Jesus rose from the dead and getting that published. But that shouldn't prevent them as human beings and having an opinion about the matter, or drawing a conclusion for themselves. And so whatever rules historians have for what they can and can't say should not limit you on what conclusions you can or can't draw. And so that's about it for the subject of miracles, unless I think of something else. So anywho, I guess the next video will be about the meaning of resurrection and how resurrection is treated in earlier Jewish literature, stuff like that.